Billionaire's fiancé forced the maid to paint on stage to humiliate her. What happened next left the entire room speechless. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. A woman in a $5,000 gown stood in front of 300 guests and pointed at the maid. Since you think you're an artist, she said, smiling for the cameras, prove it.
Paint something. Right now.
In front of everyone. The room went silent. Glasses stopped clinking. Somewhere, a waiter froze mid-step. The maid didn't cry. She didn't run. She picked up a brush. Nobody in that ballroom knew what was about to happen. Not the fiancé. Not the billionaire. Not even the maid herself. By the end of the night, one of them would lose everything. Stay with me. This one gets unbelievable. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you call home? Drop in the comments. I love seeing where this community reaches. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. It's about pride, humiliation, and a talent that could not be silenced no matter how hard someone tried to bury it. I won't tell you how it ends. I won't tell you what's coming. All I'll say is this. Keep watching until the very last section, because the twist in this one changes absolutely everything. Let's begin. The chandeliers of the Ashworth estate glittered like frozen rain over 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest guests. Maribel Reyes moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, her lavender uniform pressed to perfection, her dark hair pinned into a tight bun that had started to ache her scalp hours ago. She had worked for the Ashworth family for 6 years, ever since she arrived in New York with a suitcase and a dream that had quietly folded itself into a closet somewhere along the way. Once, Maribel had wanted to be a painter. Back in Ohio, in a cramped apartment above her mother's laundromat, she used to paint on cardboard because canvas was too expensive. Her mother used to say, "Mija, your hands were made for something beautiful." But dreams don't pay rent, and somewhere between her mother's illness and the medical bills that followed, Maribel had traded her paintbrushes for a serving tray. Tonight was the engagement gala of Nathaniel Ashworth, heir to Ashworth Steel, and his fiancée, Victoria Lang, a woman whose smile could charm a room and whose eyes could freeze it just as fast. Victoria had built her reputation on being untouchable. Old money families respected her. New money families feared her. And household staff, like Maribel, simply tried to stay invisible around her. But tonight, invisibility wasn't an option. It started with something small. Maribel had been asked, weeks earlier, to help decorate a guest room, and in a moment of boredom during her lunch break, she'd sketched a small charcoal portrait of one of the housekeepers on a spare notepad. She hadn't meant for anyone to see it. She certainly hadn't meant for Nathaniel to find it tucked behind a bookshelf while looking for a missing watch. He'd been stunned. The likeness was so alive it looked like it might blink. He'd asked around, quietly, and found out the maid, the same woman who refilled his coffee every morning, had drawn it. He never told Victoria why, only that he found Maribel's talent remarkable once at dinner, in passing, the way people say interesting things about the weather. But Victoria remembered everything. Victoria forgot nothing. And a woman who forgets nothing does not forgive being outshined by the help. So tonight, in front of New York's elite, dressed in crimson silk with diamonds she hadn't paid for herself, Victoria Lang saw her opportunity. She waited until the orchestra paused between songs. She waited until every important eye in the room had a champagne glass in hand and nowhere else to look. Then she turned, found Maribel across the room, and raised her voice just enough for it to carry. "Everyone," Victoria said, tapping her glass with a spoon, "I have a little surprise for you tonight." Maribel's stomach dropped before she even understood why. "It turns out," Victoria continued, her smile widening, "we have a hidden talent among us. Our maid here, Maribel, is it? Apparently fancies herself quite the artist." A ripple of confused laughter moved through the crowd. Nathaniel, standing a few feet away, felt his chest tighten. "Victoria," he said quietly, "don't." But Victoria was already gesturing toward a blank canvas that had, oddly, been sitting on an easel near the dessert table all evening, placed there, Maribel would later realize, precisely for this moment. "Since you think you're so talented," Victoria said, her voice sweet as poison, "why don't you show us?"
Paint something. Right now.
In front of everyone, 300 faces turned toward Maribel Reyes. Her tray trembled slightly in her hands. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. This wasn't an invitation. It was a trap dressed up as an opportunity, designed to embarrass her, to prove in front of the entire social elite that a maid was nothing more than a maid, and that people like Victoria belonged on a different level of existence entirely. Maribel set the tray down slowly on a nearby table. She thought about walking away. She thought about the 6 years of bitten-back words, swallowed pride, and quiet servitude. She thought about her mother, who had passed 2 years ago, whispering from somewhere far away, "Your hands were made for something beautiful." She looked at Victoria. She looked at the canvas. She looked at the crowd waiting, some amused, some uncomfortable, all watching. Then Maribel Reyes walked toward the easel, picked up a brush, and dipped it into the paint. The room fell silent. Nobody, not Victoria, not Nathaniel, not a single soul in that glittering ballroom, had any idea what they were about to witness. The first stroke landed on the canvas like a whisper, and for a moment, nothing about it seemed extraordinary. Victoria folded her arms, already savoring what she assumed would be a clumsy, embarrassing attempt. A few guests smirked behind their glasses. Someone near the bar chuckled and murmured something about reality TV. Nathaniel stood frozen, torn between stopping this and some strange, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, Maribel would prove his fiancée wrong. Maribel didn't look at the crowd. She had learned long ago that the moment you look at people who are waiting for you to fail, you start painting for them instead of painting for yourself. So she closed the ballroom out of her mind the way she used to close out the sound of arguing landlords and screaming sirens back in her old Ohio apartment. She found the same quiet place inside herself that she used to find at 15 years old, sitting on a fire escape with a piece of cardboard and a stolen tube of blue paint. Her hand began to move faster. She didn't paint anything ordinary, no bowl of fruit, no safe little landscape. She painted a woman with her arms raised, her hair wild, caught in some unnamed storm of grief and defiance. It wasn't Victoria. It wasn't herself. It was every woman who had ever been told she was less than what she knew herself to be. The colors bled into each other, deep violet shadows, sharp white light breaking through, a face turned upward as if daring the sky to strike her down. Slowly, the murmuring in the ballroom changed tone. The smirks faded first. Then the whispered joke stopped. One woman near the front, a well-known art collector named Delphine Wren, took a single step closer, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. "That brushwork," Delphine whispered to the man beside her. "That's not amateur. That's trained." "No, that's beyond trained. That's instinct." Victoria's smile had not changed, but something behind her eyes had. She had expected clumsy strokes, an amateur's shaky hand, something she could point at and laugh about over brunch for weeks. Instead, she was watching something that made the hair on her arms rise, though she refused to admit why. Nathaniel could not look away. He remembered the charcoal sketch he'd found weeks earlier, how it had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain, like meeting someone who understood a language he didn't know he spoke. Maribel kept painting. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The band, sensing the shift in the room, quietly stopped playing altogether. Waiters stood still along the walls, trays balanced but forgotten. Even the caterers peeked out from the kitchen doors. The woman on the canvas was beginning to breathe. At the 20-minute mark, Maribel stepped back. Her hands were shaking now, not from nerves, but from something closer to release, the way a person's whole body shakes after finally saying something they've held in for years. The painting was finished. For a long moment, nobody spoke. 300 of New York's wealthiest, most guarded people stood in absolute, stunned silence, staring at a piece of art that had just been created in front of them by a woman in a housekeeping uniform. Then Delphine Wren began to clap. It started slow, one pair of hands in a sea of silence, but it spread like wildfire. Guest after guest rising to their feet, the sound swelling until it filled the entire ballroom like thunder. Victoria Lang stood frozen in the middle of it, her carefully constructed humiliation collapsing around her in real time. And that was only the beginning of what Victoria didn't know. Because what nobody in that room realized, not Victoria, not the guests, not even Nathaniel, was that Delphine Wren wasn't just any collector. She was about to make an offer that would change Maribel Reyes's entire life. And it would expose a secret Victoria had been hiding for over a year, one that had absolutely nothing to do with art, and everything to do with why she wanted Maribel humiliated in the first place. Delphine Wren didn't just clap. She walked straight toward the easel, heels clicking against the marble floor with a purpose that silenced the last of the whispers. "Who taught you?" she asked Maribel directly, ignoring Victoria completely, which made Victoria's jaw tighten in a way she quickly tried to disguise with a laugh that came out too sharp. "No one," Maribel said quietly. "I taught myself. On cardboard, mostly. I never had money for canvas." Delphine studied the painting again, her expression somewhere between disbelief and hunger, the specific hunger of someone who has spent decades looking for something real in a world full of things that only pretend to be. "This is one of the most emotionally honest pieces I have seen in years," she said. "And I have seen thousands." She turned to the crowd. "Does anyone else feel what I'm feeling right now?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests. Someone in the back said, "I'd buy that," half joking, half serious. Delphine wasn't joking at all. "I own 3 galleries," she said, turning back to Maribel. "One in Soho, one in Los Angeles, one in Paris. I would like to give you a show. A real one. Your own exhibition." The ballroom gasped audibly. Maribel's breath caught in her throat. 6 years of carrying trays, 6 years of being spoken over, unseen, dismissed, and in the span of 20 minutes, a stranger was offering her the one thing she'd buried the deepest. But before Maribel could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "This is absurd," she said, forcing a laugh that no longer reached her eyes. "She's a maid, Delphine. A house employee. This was a party trick, nothing more." "A party trick," Delphine repeated slowly, "that just brought this entire room to its feet." She turned to Victoria with the calm, terrifying politeness of someone who has spent a lifetime dismantling people twice her size at auction. "Tell me, Victoria, was this your idea? To have her paint tonight?" Victoria hesitated a half-second too long. "I simply thought it would be entertaining." "You wanted to humiliate her," Delphine said plainly, and the words landed like a slap across the entire ballroom. "And instead, you handed her the biggest stage of her life." Nathaniel, who had been quiet the entire time, finally stepped forward. And what he said next was the twist nobody in that room, least of all Victoria, saw coming. "Victoria," he said, his voice low but carrying, "why did you really do this?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I found a sketch of Maribel's weeks ago," Nathaniel continued. "I mentioned it to you once, in passing, that I found her talented. You never brought it up again. Until tonight. You didn't set this up to entertain the guests. You set this up because you were threatened." The color drained from Victoria's face. "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice had lost its silk. "Is it?" Nathaniel said. "Because I also found something else recently. In your office. Emails, Victoria. Between you and a man named Preston Dale." Gasps rippled through the crowd again, sharper this time. Several guests exchanged glances. The name Preston Dale apparently meant something to some of them, though Maribel had no idea who he was. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time all evening. "Nathaniel, not here." "You've been planning to sell the Ashworth family's art collection," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "My late mother's collection. Behind my back. To Preston, for nearly triple what it's actually worth, because he's desperate to impress his own family before their merger next month." The ballroom had gone completely, utterly silent. "And tonight," Nathaniel continued, looking at Maribel now with something like awe, "when you found out I admired someone with real, honest talent, someone who paints from the soul, not for money, it must have terrified you. Because it reminded everyone in this room what real value actually looks like. And you couldn't stand it." Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in her carefully controlled life, Victoria Lang had absolutely nothing to say. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your eardrums. Victoria's engagement ring caught the chandelier light as her hand trembled at her side. 300 guests stared at her, and for the first time in years, she was the one who felt small. "You're overreacting," she finally said, her voice sharp but shaking. "It was a business opportunity, Nathaniel. I was going to tell you." "When?" Nathaniel asked. "After the paintings were already gone? After Preston had already wired the money?" Victoria didn't answer. Maribel stood frozen beside the easel, feeling like an outsider watching a storm that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her at the same time. 6 years of scrubbing floors in this house, and she had never once seen the Ashworth family's foundation crack this openly. Delphine Wren, ever composed, quietly stepped back to give the family space, though her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene with the sharp attention of someone who understood she was witnessing history in real time, the kind of scandal that would be whispered about in this city for years. "I built this family's reputation while you were busy pretending to care about art you don't even understand," Victoria snapped, some hidden bitterness finally breaking through the cracks in her polished exterior. "Do you know what it's like to be constantly compared to your mother? To live in the shadow of a woman everyone still worships, 5 years after she died? I was trying to prove I belonged in this family too, Nathaniel. And you couldn't even see that." For a moment, something almost like sympathy flickered across Nathaniel's face. "Almost. You could have talked to me," he said quietly. "Instead, you tried to sell my mother's memory out from under me, and then you tried to humiliate an innocent woman to distract from it." Victoria's eyes shot toward Maribel, and for just a second, something raw and unguarded passed across her face. Not hatred, but something closer to shame. "I didn't think she'd actually be good," Victoria admitted quietly, almost to herself. "That's exactly the problem," Delphine said, stepping back and with quiet authority. "You judged her before you ever gave her a chance. Most people in this room do that every single day, to people they'll never even bother to learn the names of." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Victoria could counter. Security had quietly appeared near the ballroom entrance, not for Maribel, but hovering near Victoria, waiting for a signal from Nathaniel that never quite seemed to come. He wasn't ready to have his fiancée escorted out in front of everyone. Not yet. Some final thread of the life he'd imagined with her was still holding on, however thin. "I need you to leave," Nathaniel finally said, his voice quiet but final.
Tonight.
"We'll talk about everything else tomorrow, away from all of this." Victoria looked around the ballroom one last time, at the guests who wouldn't meet her eyes, at Delphine's unreadable expression, at Maribel standing beside a painting more honest than anything Victoria had built her entire identity on. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heels echoing against the marble in a rhythm that sounded almost like retreat. The doors closed behind her. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Nathaniel turned to Maribel, and his voice, when it came, was gentler than she had ever heard it. "I'm so sorry," he said, "for all of it. Tonight, and every day before it that we let you feel invisible in this house." Maribel didn't know what to say. Her hands were still stained with paint, her heart still pounding from an evening that had turned her entire world sideways. "The offer still stands," Delphine said softly, stepping closer. "The exhibition. If you want it." Maribel looked at the painting one more time, the woman with her arms raised, caught mid-storm, refusing to be erased. "I want it," she whispered. And somewhere far above the ballroom, if her mother could see her now, Maribel liked to think she was finally proud. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a dream Maribel wasn't sure she'd earned the right to have. News of the gala spread fast, not through official channels, but the way real scandal always spreads in a city like New York, through whispers at brunch, through a grainy cell phone video someone had secretly filmed, through a single Instagram post from a guest captioned simply, "I witnessed a miracle tonight." By Monday morning, the video had over 2 million views. By Wednesday, a local news station had picked up the story, Housekeeper's secret talent stuns Manhattan elite. Maribel didn't know what to do with any of it. She still woke up at 5 in the morning out of habit, still reached for her uniform before remembering she no longer needed to wear it. Nathaniel had insisted she take paid leave for as long as she needed, though the truth was, Maribel wasn't sure leave was even the right word anymore for a life that had just been split cleanly into before and after. Delphine Wren called her personally 3 days after the gala. "I want your exhibition ready in 6 weeks," Delphine said, her voice brisk but warm. "Soho Gallery. I've already started spreading the word. Trust me, Maribel, in this business, timing is everything, and right now the entire city wants to know your name." 6 weeks. Maribel had never painted anything for an audience larger than a laundromat waiting room. Now she needed an entire body of work good enough to fill a gallery wall in one of the most competitive art markets in the world.
She almost said no.
The old fear crept back in quickly, the quiet voice that had followed her since childhood, the one that said people like us don't get to want things like this. It was the same voice that had once convinced her to trade her paintbrushes for a serving tray, that had told her survival mattered more than dreams, that beauty was a luxury for people who had never had to choose between rent and hope. But then she thought about the ballroom, the silence, the way 300 strangers had looked at something she'd made and felt something real. She thought about her mother's voice one more time. "Your hands were made for something beautiful." "I'll do it," Maribel told Delphine. The next 6 weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and trembling hands, of canvases stacked against the walls of the small apartment she still rented above a laundromat not unlike the one she grew up in. She painted women carrying invisible weight. She painted hands, worn, tired, working hands, the kind nobody ever thought to paint because they were too busy looking at faces instead. She painted her mother, from memory, standing in the doorway of their old apartment, sunlight catching dust in the air around her like she was made of gold. Nathaniel visited twice during those weeks, always with quiet respect, always careful not to overstep. Once, he brought canvases and paint supplies without being asked, leaving them outside her apartment door with a small note. No strings. Just fuel for the fire. Maribel cried when she found it, though she couldn't fully explain why. There was no word from Victoria. Rumors circulated that the engagement had been quietly called off, that Victoria had moved out of the Ashworth estate within days, that her name had started disappearing from the invitation lists of parties she once ruled effortlessly. Maribel felt no satisfaction in this. Only a strange, distant sadness, the kind you feel for someone who built their entire identity on being better than everyone else, only to discover how lonely that throne really was. 5 days before the exhibition opened, Maribel stood alone in the empty Soho Gallery, watching workers hang her paintings on stark white walls under soft golden lights. 23 pieces. 23 pieces of her life, her mother, her grief, her hope, pieces she never imagined anyone besides herself would ever see. She pressed her palm against the cool gallery wall and closed her eyes. "This is real," she told herself. "This is actually real." She had no idea that opening night would bring not just the entire New York art world through those doors, but one uninvited guest whose presence would change everything all over again. Opening night arrived wrapped in soft golden light and quiet anticipation. The gallery filled slowly at first, critics with notepads, collectors with practiced poker faces, a few curious guests from the original gala who wanted to see the woman behind the viral video with their own eyes. Delphine moved through the crowd like a conductor, introducing Maribel to names Maribel had only ever read in magazines, watching with quiet pride as jaw after jaw dropped in front of the 23 canvases lining the walls. Maribel wore a simple navy dress, nothing like the gowns she used to serve champagne at parties like this one. She felt out of place in the best possible way, like a guest in her own life for the very first time. By 8 o'clock, 3 of her paintings had already sold. By 9, 7 more. Delphine kept leaning close to whisper updated numbers into Maribel's ear, each one making her chest tighten with disbelief. "The painting from the gala," Delphine said finally, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. "The Storm Woman. I have 3 separate collectors bidding against each other for it right now." Maribel pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. 6 months ago, she had been refilling wine glasses in a house where she wasn't allowed to make eye contact with dinner guests. Tonight, people were fighting over a piece of her soul. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the gallery doors opened one final time, and the room's energy shifted in a way Maribel felt before she even saw who had walked in. Victoria Lang stood in the doorway. She looked different than she had at the gala. No diamonds, no crimson silk, just a simple black coat and an expression Maribel had never seen on her before: uncertainty. Conversations dimmed as guests noticed her, old gossip resurfacing in hushed whispers. Nathaniel, standing near the back of the gallery beside Maribel, stiffened but didn't move. Victoria didn't look at any of them. She walked straight toward Maribel, stopping a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like she was holding herself together by sheer will. "I almost didn't come," Victoria said quietly. "I told myself 100 times not to." Maribel said nothing, unsure whether to brace for another blow or extend a hand. "I saw the painting," Victoria continued, her eyes drifting toward the storm woman hanging under a warm spotlight across the room. "The one from that night. I've seen it online 1,000 times since, and every single time, it makes me feel something I don't know how to explain." She paused, swallowing hard. "I think it's because that woman on the canvas, she looks like she survived something. And I spent so many years making sure nobody around me ever looked strong enough to survive, without needing me." The gallery had gone almost completely silent now, guests pretending not to listen while listening intently. "I wanted to humiliate you that night," Victoria admitted, her voice cracking slightly, "because some small, ugly part of me knew that you had something real. Something I could never buy, no matter how much money I threw at my life. And it terrified me." Maribel studied her for a long moment. She thought about every quiet cruelty she'd endured in that house, the dismissive glances, the sharp tone, the years of being made to feel smaller than she was. She could have said any number of things. She could have let 6 years of swallowed anger finally speak. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you for coming." Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting kindness. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Victoria said quickly. "I don't think I've earned that. I just needed you to know I was wrong." Maribel nodded slowly. "People can be wrong and still choose to become something better," she said. "That's really all any of us can do." For the first time since anyone in that gallery had known her, Victoria Lang's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She left quietly a few minutes later, disappearing back into the New York night, and though Maribel would occasionally hear news of her in passing years later, a quiet donation to an arts education nonprofit here, a scholarship fund for underprivileged young artists there, the two women would never speak again. But that single exchange, brief as it was, would stay with Maribel for the rest of her life. Because it taught her something she hadn't expected the exhibition to teach her at all. Sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are simply the most afraid. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book Maribel could hardly believe was hers to read. The Soho exhibition led to a second one in Los Angeles, then a third in Paris, exactly as Delphine had promised. Maribel's name began appearing in art publications she used to flip through during her lunch breaks, never once imagining her own work would fill their glossy pages. The Storm Woman eventually sold to a private collector for a sum that made Maribel sit down on her kitchen floor and cry for 20 minutes straight, not from greed, but from the sheer, disorienting weight of finally being seen. But money, Maribel quickly learned, wasn't the part that changed her life the most. It was the letters. They started arriving a few weeks after the Soho show, forwarded through the gallery, then eventually directly to a small studio Maribel had rented in Brooklyn, the first real studio she'd ever had that wasn't a fire escape or a cramped apartment corner. Letters from young women across the country, many of them working service jobs just like she once had, telling her that her story had made them pick up a pencil again for the first time in years. A teenage girl in Detroit wrote about painting on the back of pizza boxes because her family couldn't afford canvas, just like Maribel once had. A single mother in Georgia wrote about staying up until 2 a.m. after her shifts, sketching by lamplight, finally believing her art mattered. Maribel read every single letter twice. It was around this time that an idea began forming in the back of her mind, small and quiet at first, the way most important ideas start. She approached Delphine one afternoon in the gallery office, nervous in a way she hadn't been since her very first show. "I want to start something," she said. "A foundation, maybe. Free art supplies and mentorship for kids who can't afford them. Kids like I used to be." Delphine didn't hesitate, for even a second. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said, smiling. "I already have 3 donors lined up who'd jump at the chance to fund it." Within 2 months, the Reyes Foundation for Young Artists had its first small studio space in the Bronx, a modest room with second-hand easels, donated paint, and a handwritten sign on the door that read simply, "Your hands were made for something beautiful." Maribel taught classes there herself on weekends whenever her schedule allowed, kneeling beside 8-year-olds with chalk-stained fingers, watching something light up behind their eyes the same way it must have once lit up behind hers, back before life convinced her to put it away. Nathaniel, too, remained a quiet, steady presence throughout those months, never pushing, never expecting anything in return for his early kindness, simply showing up when it mattered. He funded half the foundation's supply budget without ever mentioning it publicly, and when a journalist once asked him about his connection to the now famous artist, he simply said, "She reminded an entire room what real value looks like. The least I can do is make sure other kids get the same chance she almost didn't." It would be dishonest to say something quiet and warm hadn't begun growing between them. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, the way real things tend to grow. But that, Maribel always said later, was a different story for a different day. What mattered most to her, in that season of her life, wasn't romance or fame or even the paintings selling for numbers she still couldn't quite believe. What mattered was a small girl in the Bronx studio, no older than 10, who tugged on Maribel's sleeve one Saturday afternoon and asked, quiet and hopeful, "Do you think I could really be an artist someday? Like you?" Maribel knelt down until she was eye level with her, remembering a version of herself who once asked the universe the exact same question and heard nothing back. "You already are one," Maribel told her. "You just haven't finished proving it to yourself yet." A year to the day after the gala that changed everything, Maribel received an unexpected invitation. It came from the Ashworth family. Not from Nathaniel this time, but from the board overseeing his late mother's charitable trust. They wanted to commission a mural, a permanent piece, painted directly onto the west wall of the Ashworth estate's private garden, the same garden where Maribel used to sneak 5-minute breaks between serving shifts, staring up at the sky and wondering if her life would ever be anything more than trays and uniforms. She said yes before she even finished reading the letter. The mural took 3 weeks to complete. Maribel worked mostly alone, climbing scaffolding at dawn before the summer heat set in, mixing colors on the same kind of makeshift palette she used to use as a teenager. She painted the garden itself, reimagined, flowers blooming in impossible, vivid colors, a single figure standing at the center with her arms raised, not in distress this time, but in triumph. Sunlight instead of storm. Nathaniel visited often during those 3 weeks, sometimes just to sit quietly nearby with 2 cups of coffee, watching her work in comfortable silence. Their friendship had deepened slowly over the past year, built brick by brick on honesty rather than the desperate performance that seemed to define so much of the world Nathaniel had grown up in. It was on the final day of painting the mural, as the late afternoon light spilled gold across the unfinished wall, that Nathaniel finally said something Maribel had quietly wondered about for months, but never dared to ask. "Do you ever think about that night differently now?" he asked. "The gala. Everything Victoria did?" Maribel set down her brush, considering the question honestly before answering. "I used to think about it as the worst night of my life," she admitted. "The night I almost lost the last bit of dignity I had left." She looked at the mural rising beneath her hands, proof, undeniable and permanent, of everything that had happened since. "Now I think of it differently. It wasn't the night someone tried to destroy me. It was the night I finally stopped hiding." Nathaniel smiled, quiet and genuine. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm grateful every single day that you didn't walk away from that easel." "I almost did," Maribel admitted. "For about 2 seconds, I almost put the brush down, and just walked out of that ballroom. What stopped you? Maribel thought of her mother, of cardboard canvases, of every quiet dream she'd folded away and told herself she couldn't afford to keep. I realized, she said softly, that I'd spent my whole life being told to make myself smaller. And in that moment, standing in front of all those people, I finally understood that shrinking myself had never actually protected me from anything. It had just kept me invisible. She looked at Nathaniel, her eyes steady. So, I decided just once to take up space instead. The mural was unveiled the following weekend to Ashworth family members, foundation donors, and a small group of Maribel students from the Bronx studio, who stood at the base of the garden wall in stunned silence, staring up at a piece of art created by someone who had once stood exactly where they now stood, dreaming, uncertain, hoping the world might someday make room for them too. One of the students, the same young girl who had once asked Maribel if she could really become an artist, tugged gently on her sleeve. "You painted yourself," the girl whispered, staring up at the triumphant figure at the mural center. "Didn't you?" Maribel smiled, feeling something settle deep and warm in her chest, something that felt, for the very first time in a long time, entirely like peace. "I painted who I was always meant to become," she said. "I just needed the whole world to finally give me the chance to show them." 2 years after the gala, Maribel stood backstage at an auditorium in downtown Manhattan, her hands trembling with a nervousness that felt strangely familiar. The same nervousness she'd felt the night she first lifted a paintbrush in front of 300 strangers. Tonight, though, the stakes were different. Tonight, she wasn't proving her worth to a ballroom full of skeptics. Tonight, she was giving the keynote address at the city's largest arts education summit, standing before an audience of teachers, nonprofit leaders, and young artists from every borough of New York, invited specifically to share her story. She had rewritten her speech 4 times, unsatisfied with every version that tried too hard to sound impressive, until she finally threw the drafts away and decided to simply tell the truth. When she walked onto that stage, the applause was warm, but it was the silence that followed, the moment everyone leaned forward, waiting, that reminded her so powerfully of that ballroom 2 years earlier. 2 years ago, she began, I was asked to paint in front of a room full of strangers, not because someone believed in me, but because someone wanted to watch me fail. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many of them had seen the viral video, had followed her story in the years since. "I want to tell you what nobody talks about in that story," Maribel continued. "It's not really about talent. Talent is common. What's rare is the moment right before you use it. The moment you decide whether fear gets to make the choice for you, or whether you finally do." She spoke about her mother, about cardboard canvases and stolen paint, about 6 years of carrying trays through rooms that never saw her as anything more than furniture with a pulse. She spoke about Victoria, not with bitterness, but with something closer to understanding, describing how cruelty is so often just fear wearing an expensive dress. "I used to believe," Maribel said, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest, "that people like me weren't allowed to want big things. That dreaming past your circumstances was reckless, even selfish, when survival was already so hard to hold on to." She paused, scanning the crowd. Teachers who spent their own money on classroom art supplies, nonprofit workers who believed deeply in children the rest of the world too often overlooked. "But I've learned something since that night. Talent doesn't check your bank account before it decides to exist inside you. And the world doesn't get to decide who's allowed to create something beautiful. Only you get to decide that." She talked about the foundation, about the Bronx studio now expanded into 3 locations across the city, about hundreds of children who had come through those doors in the past 2 years, many of whom had gone on to win scholarships, gallery placements, and, more importantly, a belief in themselves that no one could take away again. "I don't tell you this story so you'll feel sorry for the woman I used to be," she said near the end of her speech. "I tell you this story because somewhere in this room, or in a classroom you teach, or in a child you haven't met yet, there is another Maribel, another person one small act of belief away from finally picking up the brush." The auditorium rose to its feet in a wave of applause that Maribel felt in her chest long after she stepped off that stage. not because of the recognition, but because of what it represented. Proof that a story once meant to humiliate her had instead become a story that helped thousands of others believe in themselves. Backstage, waiting quietly with a bouquet of white lilies, stood Nathaniel, no longer just a quiet friend, but someone who had, slowly and honestly, become something far more permanent in her life. "You were extraordinary," he said simply. Maribel smiled, exhausted and radiant all at once. "I think," she said softly, "I finally believe that myself." 5 years after that ballroom night, Maribel Reyes stood once again in front of a crowd, but this time, the room was entirely her own. The Reyes Center for Young Artists had opened that morning in the Bronx, a full building this time, not a borrowed studio room, 3 floors of classrooms, a gallery space for student work, and a scholarship program that had already sent 11 young artists to art schools across the country on full funding. Maribel had personally designed every inch of it, insisting on wide windows and warm light, remembering too well what it felt like to create beautiful things in dim, cramped spaces that made you feel small before you'd even picked up a brush. Her mother's photograph hung near the entrance, alongside a simple plaque that read, "For every hand that was made for something beautiful, and every person who was ever told otherwise." Nathaniel stood beside her at the ribbon cutting, their 2 young children weaving excitedly through the crowd of students and parents, utterly unaware of the long, unlikely road that had led to this particular Saturday morning existing at all. Delphine Wren, now more mentor than gallery owner, gave a short, warm speech about talent, timing, and the rare courage it takes to create something honest in a world that so often rewards only what's easy. But it was a familiar face near the back of the crowd that caught Maribel completely off guard. Victoria Lang stood quietly near the entrance, older now, dressed simply, holding the hand of a young girl who could not have been more than 7, a daughter, Maribel later learned, from a life Victoria had quietly rebuilt far from the world of galas and diamonds she once ruled. Victoria had funded a portion of the scholarship program anonymously for the past 2 years, something Maribel had only just discovered weeks earlier when the paperwork finally revealed her name. The 2 women exchanged a small, understanding nod across the room. No words needed, no grand reconciliation required. Just 2 people who had once collided painfully in a ballroom, now standing quietly on opposite sides of a much better story than the one that began that night. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone home and the building stood quiet and glowing under its new lights, Maribel walked alone through the empty gallery space, running her fingers gently along the frames of student paintings lining the walls, imperfect, honest, alive with the exact kind of courage she remembered feeling the very first time she picked up a brush in front of people who expected her to fail. She thought about her mother, about cardboard canvases and stolen paint, about a maid's uniform and a tray of champagne glasses trembling in her hands, about the exact moment, 5 years ago, when she had almost put the brush down and walked away. "Your hands were made for something beautiful," her mother used to say. Standing there, in a building built entirely from that single unshakable belief, Maribel finally understood the whole truth of those words, not just as comfort, but as prophecy. Friends, if this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we tell them. Every single one of us carries something inside us that the world has told us to shrink, to hide, or to save for a life that never quite arrives. Maribel's story is a reminder that it's never too late to pick the brush back up, whatever your brush happens to be. If this touched your heart tonight, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because we've got so many more waiting to be told. And if you know someone who needs to hear tonight's message, someone who's been told to make themselves smaller, please share this with them. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.